that big fat butt. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. That big fat butt. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. 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 Wiggle, 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 wiggle. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Wiggle, wiggle. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. What to do with that big fat butt? Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. You know what to do with that big fat butt? Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. You know what to do with that big fat butt? Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Wiggle with that big fat butt. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Wiggle, wiggle. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. You know what to do with that big fat butt? Go wiggle. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Jeez. You know what to do with that big fat butt? Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle.
What you gonna do with that big fat butt? Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle.
Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Wiggle, wiggle. You know what to do with that big fat butt? Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle.
Oh, she looks so beautiful when she's wiggle, wiggle, wiggle.
Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Just a little.
Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle.
You know what to do with that big fat butt? Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Wiggle. You know what to do with that big fat butt? Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. 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 Wiggle, 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 wiggle. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Wiggle, wiggle. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle.
What you gonna do with that big fat butt? Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle.
You know what to do with that big fat butt? Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. You know what to do with that big fat butt? Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle.
You know what to do with that big fat butt? Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle.
Turn down for what? Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. You know what to do with that big fat butt? Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. What to do with that big fat butt? Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Wiggle. You know what to do with that big fat butt? Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Just a little bit. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Just a little bit.